All right. I do want to go over this because this is really important and this is really what you should know and what you are responsible for. Being able to compare the four different market structures we've seen, right? So we've seen perfect competition, then we saw monopoly. So those two are at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And then we saw what was in between there, right? We saw in the last chapter kind of the type of firm that's in between but closer to the competitive end of the spectrum, monopolistic competition. And then in this chapter, we saw what's in between, but closer to the monopoly end of the spectrum, which is oligopoly. Okay, so you should be able to know all of these things. And in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you right now, this table is going to be incredibly helpful when you do your assessment. Okay, so yeah, you want to know these things, right? So how these market structures differ in terms of the number of sellers, the barriers to entry, the ability to set price, whether or not a firm can earn long run economic profits, the degree to which there's product differentiation, whether or not there's non price competition, and then maybe be able to give some examples of each of these different types of market structures. Okay, so I would encourage you to look at this for a long, hard while and make sure you know this. Okay. All right, that's the end of this chapter. You are there. A free game platform finds positive market feedback harder to find. So firms that offer free game apps for mobile devices, such as Animoca, they earn revenues in two ways. So they're free; you don't have to pay for them, but there are ways for them to earn revenues. They can either sell simulated accessories for the game. So this would be like any of those games where it's like, oh, you need tokens to do this thing in the game. Oh, you don't have enough tokens? You can buy some, right? I'm sure you've all played a game like that. Or they can collect fees from advertisers, right? So you see pop-up ads and free games all the time. That's the other way for them to make revenues. Now, advertising revenues can grow or shrink depending on whether the game app experiences positive or negative market feedback, right? So if the game does really well, then they can get a lot of money from advertisers because the advertisers can see that a lot of people are playing the game and spend a lot of time playing the game. Whereas if people aren't really interested in the game, it's not being played by a lot of players, then the game's going to have a hard time finding people to advertise with them, right? Because they want eyes on their ads, right? So there you go. Interesting example of a weird sort of potential oligopoly. All right, and then let's go back to this ticket resale industry, right? 130 ticket resellers. So it sounds like a lot of firms, right? But as it turns out, it's not very competitive type of industry. So it's actually much closer to oligopoly, even though there seems to be relatively large number of firms, right? So despite the large number of firms in the ticket resale industry, StubHub captures half of the industry's annual sales. So StubHub by itself captures 50% of the industry's sales. Now, if you include Ticketmaster in there, the two-firm concentration ratio for this industry is 62%, which means Ticketmaster accounts for 12% of industry sales. Now, looking at the HHI, it exceeds 2,600, which is much higher than the HHI value of less than 80 that would result if all ticket resellers instead had equal market share. Okay, so obviously highly concentrated, especially if we look at the HHI. And so this industry follows the dominant firm model in which StubHub is not a monopoly, but instead faces competition from a group of sort of fringe firms. So pretty interesting that even though there's 130 firms, it's really still an oligopoly because there's such concentration in the top firms, right? So there you go. You've got StubHub at 50%, Ticketmaster at 12%. And the other 125 or so ticket resellers account for the remaining 38%. All right, so this is what we saw, right? A quick summary of our learning objectives. We looked at the fundamental characteristics of oligopoly and how they can come to existence, including economies of scale, barriers to entry, and the fact that it gives rise to strategic dependence. We talked about the alternative methods of measuring industry concentration ratio, with the concentration ratio and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, and we saw that there is a slight problem with the concentration ratio, and it doesn't give us the full picture. The HHI kind of gives us a better picture. We looked at how we can apply game theory to evaluate pricing strategies of oligopolistic firms. So looking at competition for payoffs and how firms have reaction functions. They might respond differently depending on what their competition does. But nevertheless, we saw that there are, they're basically in a prisoner's dilemma, and so there's just dominant strategies, right? It actually doesn't matter what the other firm does. You should always charge a low price if you're in an oligopoly. So interesting outcomes there. And then we wrapped it up by identifying features of an industry that help or hinder efforts to form cartels, which seek to restrain output and earn higher economic profits by collectively acting like a monopoly. And so this really can only happen if there's a relatively small number of firms. They sell a relatively undifferentiated product, such as oil. It's easily they can easily observe prices, and there's low variation in prices. All these things help to sort of detect cheaters. And again, you're not responsible for Section 5, so don't worry about that. Okay. All right. That was the last chapter for the term. I hope you guys enjoyed this term. I know it was kind of weird because it had to be virtual due to the pandemic. But at this point, we still have a couple weeks left. So it's not that you don't have anything to do, right? Basically, at this point, there's a couple of things that you are still, responsible for. So we do have a final exam, which covers everything we've gone over this term. It's cumulative, so it covers these last few chapters that we haven't had an exam on yet, but it also covers all the material from previous exams. So everything is included on the final exam. You still have the opportunity to go back and retake any of the homeworks that we have. Okay, so those will be available until the last day of class, and you can still try to get a better grade on your homeworks. And as it turns out, it's a great way to study for the final, right? So you can do that. You do have a few quizzes still that are due, so keep an eye out for those. And then the last thing is you are required to complete an assessment that I mentioned actually just a few slides ago with that table. But the assessment is basically getting at how well you understand these major concepts in this class, particularly related to these different types of market structures. And that's I can't remember if it's 5 or 10% of your grade, but in any case, the nice thing is you basically are going to have at least a week to work on these assessments. You can use your notes, the book, any outside resources that you might find searching Google or whatever. You can watch the video lectures if you need to, again, to help you with the assessment. You can use whatever resources you have at your disposal. But it's basically a couple of short essay questions that you'll have to answer. And I'll also be providing you with the grading rubric so you can see what I'm looking for when I'm going to be grading these things. So, but that's basically what's coming up for you in the next couple of weeks before we end the term. So don't forget to tell me what you would do in the prisoner's dilemma for your discussion post, and keep an eye out for the assessment, which I'll release soon, and start studying for the final. If you have any questions, please reach out to me via email, or you can text me. Don't forget that that's one way to reach out to me, and I am usually quicker to respond if you text me, so keep that in mind. But I am here to help you with any questions you have or any concerns. I hope you enjoy the term, and I hope you have a good summer. Thanks for watching.